Okay, next we have an In Conversation session. It is a huge honour to introduce this session. It's a conversation between two of the most significant authors, thinkers and activists in the field of community land, Andy Wightman and Professor James Hunter. Jim, in particular, as I'm sure will be discussed over the next hour or so, has been at the forefront of this field for the past half-century or so, since the publication of the paradigm-shifting Making of the Crofting Community 50 years ago. His work has had a significant influence on me and many others. Indeed, he has influenced and inspired so many others that a conference was held last week entirely dedicated to the discussion of just how influential and inspiring he has been. For me as an academic, it's not just his subject matter, focusing as he does on the land and people of the Highlands and Islands throughout his career, which has inevitably also brought him into the study of community land ownership. It's also the way in which he's combined his academic endeavours with more practical roles, directly focusing on policy and practice and making tangible change. In modern academic parlance, we might call this impact, with money to be made through ref impact case studies. I suspect for Jim it was simply the obvious thing to do. And then there's Andy, whose book The Poor Had No Lawyers is also essential reading for any community land scholar. Our understanding of Scotland's infamous land ownership concentration relies on his often quoted and even more often misquoted statistics developed as part of his life's work on who owns Scotland. Our understanding of the need for and ongoing success of land reform in Scotland largely relies on Andy's work. I won't bang on any longer, except to suggest that these are two of the giants upon whose shoulders we, as community land researchers, are privileged to be able to stand. Andy.
Wow, thanks very much. Well, welcome, Jim, and thanks for coming along today. When we were planning this conference, we did want to get some kind of historical context, which is why we had a panel at the beginning of yesterday, and also why we thought it'd be a great idea to have you along, because as Bobby said, you know, you've been at the centre of much of this debate over the past 30, 40, indeed 50 years. And just, you know, a few things for those, because I'm aware that those of us of advancing years, or maybe half the audience is under 30, and there's a sense in which the 1980s and the 1990s is a distant past. But Jim was chair of the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust from 2004 to 2007, chair of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Public Development Agency from 98 to 2004, the first director of the Scottish Crofters Union, founded the Scottish Crofters Union 1985 to 1990, and the first director of the UHI Centre for History. So played a really important role in wider outreach and communication and development and advocacy and campaigning around ideas on land. And yes, last week's seminar, I was just looking at, I feel very privileged to have a copy of this first edition of this book. It's one of the first non-fiction books I ever bought, in fact, when I left school. And the thing that gripped me wasn't so much the crofting. I was a bit mystified by all this complexity and history, but it was the style of the writing that grabbed me. Very, very, very readable. And I was just looking online, in fact. You can pick up a copy now for £190. That's not even signed. There's money to be made yet. Anyway, let's begin just by, I mean, on this topic, what got you into history as a historian, and what in particular inspired you to do a PhD on the making of the crofting community?
I should begin by mentioning you can still buy a copy of a current edition for a lot less than that. So, but do
you want to hold it maybe like that one more?
How's that?
That's good.
Okay. Yeah. How did I get into all this? Well, I was born in 1948 in a wee place called Dura in the north part of Argyll. It was then. It's now just inside the Highland Council boundary. And my mother ran the local post office out of her house, and my father was what they then called a trapper. They would now call a ranger with the Forestry Commission. But living with us when I was a boy was my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, His name was John Cameron. He'd been born in 1872, so his life spanned a long, long period. He was one of the first generation to go into state schooling in the 1870s. And when he went to school, he could speak not a word of English, and his teachers, certainly for the first 2 or 3 years, couldn't speak any Gaelic. So I guess it was very difficult for him. But one attribute he brought to our household was, like so many people of that background, he was a consummate storyteller. And he spoke a lot about the past, some of which, of course, or a lot of which he'd lived through. And I would like to be able to say that as a wee boy, I sat at his feet and drank it all in, but that would be a lie. But something of this stuck with me. I went eventually to Aberdeen University to study history, and it was kind of borne in upon me then that what my grandfather, the rest of my family, and I think the Highland people more widely, thought about their own past was completely different to the portrayal of that past by the then academic establishment. And so when I went on to do a PhD at Edinburgh University in the then Department of Scottish History, what I was setting out to do was create a version of Highland history, tell the story of the 19th century into the 20th century that was true, or at least I hoped it was true, to what Highlanders thought about their history, but it was simultaneously academically reputable. In other words, it had lots of footnotes and stuff like that. And that book is essentially my PhD with just 1 or 2 modifications. So that's how it all began. There was another, and I want to mention this particularly in the light of what we heard this morning, because there was another big influence on my approach to these things. And it derives from the fact that at Aberdeen University, when I was there as an undergraduate, the professor of history was a man called John Hargreaves, and one of his associates was called Roy Bridges. And both John Hargreaves and Roy Bridges had begun their academic teaching career in Africa. John in Sierra Leone, and Roy, I think, in what's now Malawi, though it was then Nyasaland. And so I did a course in African history. And this was in the 1960s. I went to university in 1967. And in the 1960s, there was beginning to be something of a revolution in approaches to African history. African history prior to that had mainly been the story of colonial administrators and missionaries and traders and so on. And but increasingly, there was beginning to be an attempt to write African history that put Africans at the center of the history, rather than as people who were simply on the receiving end of what others did to them. There was, at that time, there was the Regius Professor of History in Africa, in Oxford, a man called Hugh Trevor Roper, was utterly dismissive of this. And he wrote that there was a history of Europeans in Africa, and the rest was the meaningless gyrations of obscure tribes. And why that was important to me was that the Highlands weren't colonized in the way that Africa was colonized, though there were colonialist attitudes involved. But the standard approach at that time to the history of the Highlands looked and depended entirely on government records, estate archives, that sort of thing. And I felt that was analogous to what had been the case in Africa. And just as there was a need to put Africans at the center of their history, it seemed to me there was a need to put Crofters and Highlanders more generally at the center of their history. So that's what I set out to do. And that's how the thing began, as it were. And my PhD which in these happy days was written in 30 months from start to finish, with the kind of overweening confidence of youth. I was determined to create an entirely new, well, maybe not entirely new, but pretty new approach to Highland history. So that's what that book was.
Excellent. So moving on, I mean, obviously you went on to write many other books in your career, which we don't have time to cover, but they focused on different elements of Highland history. One in particular, I think, was your Millennial History of the Highlands and Islands, which personally for me helped me understand the really, really difficult 17th century, which I think many people grapple with. But can you give us a flavour of, because you worked then as a journalist for the Press and Journal, and did some broadcasting, give us a flavour of the sort of land question. Where was the land question in public consciousness, in academic research, in politics, during the 1980s into the 1990s?
Well, when I was working initially as a journalist for the P&J for 5 years, and then for several years after that as a freelance journalist and broadcaster, the whole issue of land and its ownership was beginning to emerge as a subject of some political interest and importance. It was a gradual process. It was also quite new because there had been a sort of upsurge of land agitation and political activism and reform, far-reaching reform, in the later part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. But then from the 1920s onwards, all that kind of rather came to a halt. And it wasn't till the 1970s that you began to see something of a renewed interest in the possibility of land reform. And a key text with regard to that was a book by John McEwen called Who Owns Scotland, which John McEwen was, if you like, the progenitor of the sort of work that Andy has since been doing in so much more detail. And John McEwen was a retired forester. He was a remarkable man. The book was published when he was 90 years old, and he lived to be well over 100. And I remember going to interview John McEwen in his home in Perthshire, and that was a kind of real privilege. I remember him telling me that one of his formative political experiences was related to the Liberal government, the very radical reforming Liberal government that was elected in 1906. And he was a trainee forester on the Seafield Estates at that time. And he told me he was so naive about these things, but in the day or two after the election, the Liberal Party was pledged to fairly far-reaching land reform. He half expected to see various ducal figures hanging on telegraph poles, but for better or worse, that didn't happen. But what he set out to do was to identify the biggest estates in Scotland and what their acreages were in approximate terms, and also to make the case for sweeping reform. John himself, a long-standing stalwart in the Labour Party, his personally preferred solution was land nationalisation. But what his book did was highlight the extraordinary concentration of ownership, which then sort of began to emerge as a public issue. And from that point on, there was at least the beginnings of a political interest in the question on the part of, certainly on the part of the SNP, to an extent the Liberals at that time and others. So I think it was then beginning to be an issue. Occasionally I was what they called a features writer on the P&J, but occasionally when the deputy editor was on holiday, he usually wrote the editorials, and I wrote them when he was away, or some of them. And I remember writing an editorial which more or less committed the P&J to land nationalisation. It's perhaps a measure of the influence or lack of influence of the press that land nationalisation still hasn't happened. But it'll be there somewhere in the archives. So yeah, it was beginning to be an issue, and it focused particularly, what brought it very much to the fore and became something of a bone of contention in the press and elsewhere at that point, and I'm talking about the late 70s into the early 80s, was the beginnings of people from overseas buying land, principally because, of course, they could buy land in Scotland, large quantities of it, with no checks or any controls of any kind. So it was very convenient from their point of view. Some of them had rather dubious antecedents, shall we say. I'm conscious this is being recorded, so I'm not sure how long libel laws last, but there was a particularly controversial figure, a Dutchman called Johannes Hellinger, who was buying land on this kind of basis. And there were others also, and that rather highlighted it. So yeah, it was beginning to emerge as an issue, but there was very little political action on this question at that time, as opposed to the beginnings of discussion and debate about it.
You raise an important point, because Jonas Hellingas and others provided a regular stream of stories that could be told that generated outrage. And I think in no small part that helped to fuel the growing sentiment that Scotland needed a parliament, because we'd had the 1979 devolution referendum, which had been lost. And we were under this long period of Conservative rule, with at every election a declining number of Conservative MPs in Scotland. I mean, a little flavour here. So Jim was quoted on BBC on Yorpa in October 1995. I don't remember the particular context, but I quote it in my book. And he was asked in response to the suggestion that landowners might feel threatened by the developing debate about land ownership. And Jim said this: "The more they feel threatened, in my view, the better. They need to feel threatened, and they should feel threatened, because there can be no future in the 21st century for a rural economy dependent on tweedy gentlemen coming from the south to slaughter our wildlife. That is not the way to run the Highlands and Islands." And it does give you a flavour of both the of both the Jim's capacity to kind of pull words together to express ideas, because that's not just Jim's view, that reflected the view, a deep-seated view of many, many people across the Highlands and Islands at the same time. Now, of course, at the same time in the 90s, we're talking the early 90s, you had the situations on Egg and Knoydart developing. And I want to introduce this into this story, a character that I think you and I have agreed in the past. We are maybe the only two members of the Michael Forsyth Appreciation Society. Michael Forsyth was Secretary of State for Scotland between 1995 and 1997. I want to ask you your reflections on him and his role, but I was at the time very involved with the Lagan Community Trust, who wanted to take over some Forestry Commission land. And Michael Forsyth very helpfully put out a statement saying that Lagan shall have its forest. And he was just the first politician in power who gave an indication that actually he was quite sympathetic. And then also I remember he visited Rum in a helicopter, and I phoned his special advisor, Gerald Warner, saying bad things are kicking off on Egg, particularly at that moment. Would Michael Forsyth mind just landing on Egg on his way home and having a word with folk who are facing eviction, etc. And he did, to his credit, and very helpfully, I put to Gerald Warner. Gerald Warner was a very, very right-wing person. So I gave him a very, very mild quote. I think, well, you'll do that. And then I gave him quite a radical quote, and then I gave him something in the middle, and it's not one in the middle he used. So Michael Forsyth, Conservative MP, Secretary of State for Scotland, an acolyte of Margaret Thatcher and free market economics, said, "Frankly, I was rather appalled by the description the residents presented of an island whose infrastructure is crumbling and which is suffering from serious neglect. The present situation is pretty shocking and is not sustainable. The islanders have a right to a degree of security." So I was wondering, we're sitting in the UHI, which is a creature of Michael Forsyth's politics. How did that feel? Because at that time, we began to feel hopeful, I suppose, A, that the Tory government was coming to an end and we're going to get a Labour government elected on a manifesto commitment for a parliament. Was this Michael Forsyth just trying to kind of capture the zeitgeist at the time, or do you think there was more to it than that?
Well, I was very impressed by him, actually. When he became Secretary of State for Scotland, on being interviewed on the telly that evening, he said if anyone had any ideas as to what he should be doing, could they write him a letter? This was rather reckless. Rather also kind of is a pointer to the guy, because very few politicians on taking office at that level would do that. They would assume that they knew everything and everybody else knew very little. Whereas he was actually actively looking for suggestions as to what he could do. And the gist of my rather long letter to him was that the Tories had got themselves onto the wrong side in the Highlands. They were totally identified with utterly unproductive, mainly absentee landlords, and the people who were doing everything that the Tory government and Margaret Thatcher said they should be doing, standing on their own feet, making their own lives, etc., were people like crofters. And they should therefore be on their side and not the landlord's side. And he was in Skye, I think it was the day he opened the Skye Bridge, actually. And he was visiting Solmore Usting, the Gaelic College. And I was summoned into his presence when he was there and spent an hour or more with him. And it was like a very rigorous university situation where you might have presented an essay to your professor or whatever. And I was grilled about all this very thoroughly. And what Andy and I were talking earlier, he was, in a way that I think few politicians of the present moment would be, he was extremely well informed, well read, and a very rounded knowledge of things. And he was really interested in this issue. And that rung very true. And he actually, the first piece of modern land reform legislation in Scotland was his act, the Transfer of Crofting Estates Act of 1997. I think probably the very last piece of legislation passed by the Conservative government before Tony Blair's Labour Party took over. And what I remember about that was I had suggested to him the recreation of something called the Highland Panel, which after the Second World War was a sort of gathering of Highland MPs, senior councillors and others to shape and give direction to policy for the Highlands. And he had come up with a kind of equivalent in what's still called the Convention of the Highlands and Islands. And at an early meeting of the Convention of the Highlands and Islands, Michael Forsyth outlined what he was thinking about in regard to crofting estates. These were estates that dated from an earlier period of land reform, from the land settlement period, the creation of new crofts, hundreds of them, by the state in the years before and after the First World War. And the point of the legislation, which ended up being far more complicated than Forsyth wanted, was to enable people on these estates to take them over into a sort of community ownership. But when he began to introduce this, he prefaced it with this remark. He said, "I want to make clear at the outset that I am not a Bolshevik." Now, anyone who knows anything about Michael Forsyth then or later would, I think, not really be likely to confuse him with V.I. Lenin, but he was fascinating. It's very unusual to find a senior politician who took that sort of interest in anything. And as Andy said, he'd go and speak with people on the ground in a way that it's hard to imagine any subsequent Secretary of State or more recently First Minister of Scotland doing. I just can't envisage that happening. Casual conversations with people on the ground in places like Assynt, which he also visited, and Egg and so on. So yeah, intriguing guy. I think he's now the Speaker of the House of Lords. And I don't know.
26, yes.
I don't know how much of all of this he remembers or reflects on, but you could do worse than invite him here to do that thing. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. So interesting, because of course his successor was Donald Dewar, Secretary of State for Scotland, and then obviously later First Minister. Also a man that was well read, famously well read, and someone from the Labour tradition who in the 1950s, I think he stood for Parliament, I may have this wrong, first in an Aberdeen seat, advocating the abolition of feudal tenure. So we had politicians. Michael Forsyth understood the land question. His solutions may not have been as far-reaching as you and I would have got, but he kind of got part of the essence of that. So that takes us to the 1990s, and you've already mentioned John McEwen, and during the 1990s, there was a series of lectures, memorial lectures, because John McEwen had died in 1992, I think, yeah. So there was a series of an annual lecture, and these were designed to be high-profile events delivered by significant voices in the academy on the importance of the land question. And they were politically designed to build support for the then anticipated arrival of the Scottish Parliament. Quite when it was going to come, no one was very sure, but the Conservatives were going to get voted out at some stage, and Labour were at that point committed to a much, much more fulsome Scottish Parliament than they had been back in 1979. So Jim gave the second John McEwen Memorial Lecture in 1995. And I just want to quote you, your words back to you. And this is at the end of the section called The Land Reform Locomotive. Quote, a parliament, and we were all anticipating, as I say, the arrival of the Scottish Parliament. A parliament which is prepared to act decisively on land will be a parliament which will thus demonstrate its willingness to alter land fundamentally. A parliament which conversely shies away from land reform will be a parliament which, by its dodging of this most symbolic issue, will make clear that, though we shall again have our own legislature, great consequences will not follow from that fact. And then you go on to make a series of recommendations, which if we've got time, we can run through in relation to whether, they've been fulfilled or not. But I suppose my question then to you is, have we had a parliament now for a quarter of a century that demonstrates a willingness to alter Scotland fundamentally, or have great consequences not followed from 1999?
Well, we've had a parliament which has certainly produced a lot of land reform legislation. We've had a parliament which has produced a lot of land legislation. Some of it, all of it committed in principle to achieving good things. But it's been very, very timid in comparison to earlier times. Where I began in all of this was investigating the history, not least the crofting agitations of the 1880s, which led to the passing of the first Crofters Act in 1886 by a Liberal government headed by William Gladstone. Now, what's striking about that is the willingness of Parliament then to actually do things that were extremely far-reaching and radical, and which it's hard to imagine the Scottish Parliament as currently constituted even contemplating something as radical, never mind actually doing it. Because what that act did was crofters had no security of tenure whatsoever. They were granted a form of security of tenure after the agitation and after the Act, which not only gave them individuals lifetime security, but created a sort of security in perpetuity, so that a holding could be passed on either to that person's family or indeed to somebody else. And even more, so that took away all control of the landowners over security. Evictions of the Highland clearance type were no longer possible. But what was even more striking in a way was the fact that rents, the fixing of rents, was taken away from the landlords as well and vested in a judicial tribunal, originally called the Crofters Commission and today called the Scottish Land Court. And so a landowner had no real control of any kind whatsoever now over a land and crofting tenure. And that, it's hard to imagine current legislatures, whether in Scotland or anywhere else in the UK, contemplating something of that sort. And then came further agitation on the ground, because though the Act of 1886 gave security of tenure and fixed fair rents and so on, it didn't do the other thing that the then Highland Land League was desperate to have done, which was to restore to crofters and others the land, vast quantities of which had been taken away, so to speak, at the time of the Highland clearances. And so there was further agitation, and there was then so-called land settlement legislation in the run-up to the First World War and after it, which made that possible. And again, strikingly radical by current standards. It enabled, for instance, if a group of people in any locality wanted to have land holdings and there was land available that these land holdings could be created on, then the Board of Agriculture for Scotland, as it then was, had to, it didn't have any choice in the matter, it had to respond to this by acquiring land and setting up such holdings. And that happened on a substantial scale. And there was also a power vested in the Board of Agriculture, which was that even without the state, as it were, taking over land, the board could compel landowners, whether they liked it or not, to themselves establish such holdings on land that would be designated for that purpose. Now, these were fundamental, far-reaching reforms. Arguably, they didn't go far enough either. But when you compare the thrust of that with the pretty pussyfooting approach of more recent governments to land reform in Scotland, then the contrast is very, very striking. Now, it's better that what's gone through in the way of land reform is certainly an awful lot better than nothing. Don't get me wrong on that front, but it's not going to, of itself, change the situation with regard to land in Scotland and its ownership fundamentally. And in fact, over the last few years, the concentration of ownership, which Andy has, say, highlighted so effectively, it's getting worse rather than better. And whether the latest Land Reform Act will make much difference to that, to be honest, I rather doubt. There are aspects of it, like the ability to lot estates that are on the market, i.e. divide them up, that have radical potential. But whether it's actually done to any extent will depend on the commitment of people in Parliament. And again, I'm rather dubious about the commitment being there to actually push that along and explore it, so to speak, to its full potential.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Parliament, I remember you were a member of the Land Reform Review Group in 2015, a rather sorry experience. I think we'll just sort of skate over to it. But at the time, I remember we put together a list of all the land reform measures, and there were actually quite a lot. I mean, abolition of feudal tenure, national parks, leasehold reform, agricultural tenant right to buy, community right to buy, crofting community right to buy, statutory right of access, real burdens, etc. There were actually, quite a lot. Now, your recommendations back in '95, let's just run through them. One, feudalism should be eradicated from our land law. Well, that was done very early on, feudal abolition. 2000, year 2000, happened in 2004. Owners of land should be placed in something approximating to a direct relationship with the Crown or the sovereign people of Scotland. Now that picked up a debate about, okay, we could abolish feudal tenure, but should we replace it with something more conditional, which we've not done. Managerial responsibilities and revenue-raising powers, which are still in Crown control, should be transferred from the Crown Estates to coastal communities. Well, it's been transferred to Crown Estate Scotland, but not to communities. State-owned crofting estates should be placed in community ownership. I think you envisage that there should be a mandatory. Yeah, that's obviously not happened. Privately owned crofting estates should be placed in community ownership. You were basically saying abolish landlords on crofting estate. That's not happened. Farming tenants should be legally entitled to buy their farms. Well, they can, but only if and when it's sold. Either by outright sale or by mechanisms which simply transfer management to others. Forestry Commission land should be made available to a wide range of rural residents. Not really. There's some asset transfers happen, but not. New types of settlement should be established widely in the Highlands and Islands countryside. That's not happened. We just heard of the experience on Mull with woodland crofts. And of course, the 1919 Land Settlement Act is still in the statute book. And you wrote a book, didn't you, with the Land Commission on the centenary of that act? Because I remember looking at that and thinking, could we actually competently make an application under the 1919 legislation now? But if you look at it on legislation.gov.uk, it's been so filleted and amended that it's got vast gaping holes in it, so probably not. Land ownership should be conditional on the observation of a land use code. That's not happened. And a land commission should be established to facilitate these and other reforms. We've got a land commission, but it's not designed to facilitate or have any role directly in the intervention. So a mixed bag.
Yeah. Well, there have been some things happen, but I don't think the situation has changed fundamentally. Getting rid of feudal relics in land law was clearly a priority for a lot of people. And in fact, the Scots Law Commission had advocated that from way back. I couldn't give you the exact date. So yes, that was all of that was helpful. But again, I don't think there's been sufficient political engagement with the issue. And I think there are, I'm certainly not of an age to raise a red flag in the Highlands, but I think what distinguishes, it's not just the unwillingness of politicians to grapple with this issue. They're not really under much pressure to do so. And I think that's the other contrast between now and the past. The crofting legislation of 1886, for example, didn't just fall from the sky. And it didn't just flow from the beneficent thought of William Gladstone, though he was extraordinarily prepared to do very radical things. It was a response to very widespread agitation on the ground across the Highlands in the shape of land raids, illegal seizures of land, rent strikes, and all of which led to repeated confrontations with the police and indeed with the military. And so the reforms were, in a sense, well, more than in a sense, the reforms were a response to what was going on the ground, which had become extremely disruptive. And you can see parallels with what was happening at the same time in Ireland, all of which was still part of the UK, where there was equally far-reaching and ultimately more far-reaching land reform. But there's no equivalent of that pressure today. Why there isn't is a very complex question, which I'm in no position to answer. But I think that has to happen. Now, the sort of work that's been going on that we heard about today, and you no doubt heard about yesterday, by academics now into aspects of community land ownership and ownership more generally, that's hugely to be welcomed. There was nothing of that when I was first engaging with this issue. There was no academic interest in land reform and community ownership at all, zero, none. So, that's a step forward. But again, it of itself, while hugely valuable, it will not put politicians back against the wall, so to speak. And I think that's ultimately what's lacking. As I say, why it's lacking, I don't know. It's not just a matter of land reform per se in the abstract. It's connecting land reform with things in the Highlands and indeed in rural Scotland and indeed in other rural areas beyond Scotland. Issues like the increasingly appalling inability of young people to acquire somewhere to live in the Highlands. And you know that is a tragedy, particularly because it coincides with a period when, unlike when I was young, way back in the 60s or whatever, most of us growing up in the Highlands just took it for granted that if we wanted to get on in the world, we'd have to leave. And that's no longer the case. Survey work by HIE and others has demonstrated that there's a very wide commitment on the part of young people today in places like the Highlands to make a life for themselves in that locality. And they can't, because they can't find anywhere to live. And that's a disaster. It's not, things are happening that ease it a bit at the edge, but again, there's no real momentum to get the problem tackled. And land reforms are part of that problem. When you think about it, there's no lack of land in the Highlands. A lot of it's, in any real terms, pretty worthless actually. And you can have a patch of a few square yards really of pretty rubbishy hill grazing that the minute it's given, the minute that planning permission is given to put a house on that, rises in value from next to nothing to well in excess of £100,000. And that's an absurdity. And to tackle that, to make that impossible, to give local authorities back and government back the sort of powers they had to acquire land prior to the 1950s, when a local authority or some other public institution wanted to take land to build something on, it was transferred at existing use value. So instead of the £100,000 plus for the few square yards of indifferent hill grazing, you'd get just a few quid. And that in itself would make an enormous difference. But again, it requires pressure and it requires political willingness to return to the pre-1950 situation when that was standard.
Good. Well, on that point, I think we'll open it up for questions because that's been quite a rich and very brief romp through a few decades of life in community land. So, any questions?
Hello, thank you very much for that. I guess what I wanted to ask draws on what you were saying, Jim, about how the conditions are there really for unrest, but unrest maybe isn't happening at the moment. And I was just minded, because I was revisiting this book recently on John McCaskill writing about the Asant Crofters Trust. And he's basically saying that John Mackenzie was being interviewed by someone from the BBC, Eric Robson, I believe, who's basically who's asking, is all of this just about getting back at the landowners, at the landlords? And John Mackenzie said, no, it's about us fighting for what we consider our historic right. So do you think that we need to make more of an argument here broadly across Scotland that people have a kind of moral right to the land, and that in essence we're fighting for a kind of, that this is a social justice movement for us regaining that kind of historic right?
Well, yeah, in principle, I would agree with that. It's really, I suppose, and again, this was touched on this morning by speakers from Africa. Ultimately, what's happened is the capitalisation of land. And this began to happen in the Highlands a long time ago. But also, the community, the wider community, which had a stake in that land in the past, and I'm talking about the more distant past now, lost that stake. And to regain it would, of course, require the overturning of quite a lot of the legalities around property rights today, where land is essentially treated as a tradable commodity and not much else. And again, people touched on this, I think, this morning, that community land ownership, as it's currently established and as it's currently assisted, so to speak, to come into being, it's essentially treated the same way. It's simply that the title, so to speak, transfers from some individual to the community group, the community trust. But going beyond that, I don't know. But I think it's necessary to make concrete connections of that kind. What I meant when the quote that Andy read out about the Scots Parliament, that if it didn't do something far-reaching about land, the chances were it wouldn't do anything far-reaching about anything else, I think is the case. And how you really have to, land reform, we can all get exercised sort of in the abstract about the fact that just over 400 people own half the land in Scotland effectively. But you have to connect that to, it's a bit like, I suppose, the argument for Scottish independence. We're sort of told by a certain political party that Scottish independence is a great thing to have. But it's always sort of couched, a bit like Brexit was, that once this is achieved, the land will flow with milk and honey. And it may do, though I doubt it, but to actually say to people, look, we stand for independence, say, or the creation of a Scottish Parliament, not because it's a good thing in itself, but because it will enable us to do certain things, one of which could be that. And to actually make concrete connections between political objectives and actually delivering something to the generality of people, something meaningful in a day-to-day way, I think is essential. And it's a rather sad commentary, I think, on politics, certainly in this country, and by this country I mean not just Scotland but Great Britain, that there seems to be an awful lack of capacity to actually envisage doing fundamental and far-reaching change. I said I was born in 1948. I'm about 6 or 7 weeks older than the National Health Service. I've said to my GP recently that I'm much the same age as the National Health Service, and neither of us are quite as good as we were. But what's remarkable about that the NHS was created by Clement Attlee's Labour government at a time when this country was literally bankrupt. Its back was to the wall financially and in all sorts of other ways. Rationing of everything, foodstuffs and so on, was still all pervasive and controlling. And yet they were able to do that because they were able to envisage that they had the power to do it, and they just did it. Now today we're given 1,000 reasons why it's impossible to do anything infinitely more modest in its objectives than creating a national health service. And land and land reform are just part of that. And quite how that can change, short of a revolution, I don't know. But it has to change if we're going to move forward.
Can I take the privilege of having the mic to ask a question? Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Andy. And I want to say, firstly, a comment, which then leads to a question. The comment being that you two have used research to shine a light on injustices in a way that has been profoundly impactful for all of us in this room and for many people across Scotland and globally. And we are researchers in this room and community members as well. And I'm wondering, perhaps a response from both of you, how can we as a kind of collective use the power of research and discovering things to shine a light on some of the injustices today and kind of mobilise to potentially push forward action that we kind of want to see and we've touched on. So yeah, that kind of role of research and shining a light on something in quite a profound and powerful way.
Andy, you.
I'll go first. I mean, I think my experience in this is that telling stories is very important, and you know, this is a story. We all tell stories. They're very important at revealing truths, but to do hard-nosed research involves having access to information, and I think that's the predominant challenge in the community land situation. In the wider land research, is we don't have access to the kind of data and information that would enable us to do any kind of monitoring or evaluation or impact studies, etc. And I remember at the Hutton Institute conference last year, where there was a Dutch official from the Dutch government talking about land registration and data. And I asked him, I said, I don't expect an answer now, but would you be able to tell me how many women aged between 30 and 50 bought between 10 and 15 hectares of land in the province of Friesland in the Netherlands between 1985 and 1990? Is that a question you could answer? And there was a lot of laughter in the room. But he ultimately said, yeah, we do actually have the data to answer that question. I've never been asked that question. We don't tend to want to answer those questions, but we could. And without that information, without that kind of data across a whole series of fields, and it's not that it doesn't exist, it does exist, it's just not captured in a way that's terribly useful. And the world's moved on. We live in a digital world. I mean, a lot of the data now is captured digitally. Things are being digitized, and that's making research obviously much, much easier, particularly in terms of historical sources, and scanning of documents and making them more accessible over the internet. But still, that fundamental access to data, I think, is a real problem. And before we attempt to do any more kind of far-reaching research, I think we need to sort that basic question.
Yeah, I wouldn't add to that. I think that's absolutely correct. And I do, just sitting here this morning, I'm afraid I wasn't able to be here yesterday, but sitting here this morning and just listening to and getting a sense of the huge amount of work that's being done in Clan and elsewhere on these issues, it's actually very heartening. And because, as I said, there was a time when there was no such research at all. And that's good, but it's got to also inform government. And it's also, and there was discussion of this morning, and it's something I've long felt strongly about, that when academics or anyone else does conduct research with communities, it is terribly important to feed back to them the outcome of that and share the outcome with them, because there was a tendency in the past for that not to happen at all. And so I think that's good. There was I always remember reading somewhere that the average Inuit family consisted of a man, a woman, 2 children, and a social anthropologist. and so it's not reached quite that stage in the Highlands yet, I don't think. But to make the thing meaningful to people, for them to be able to engage with it when the research is going on, and equally important, arguably more important, to feed back what this has produced and how it might enable them to improve their own position. I think that's terribly, terribly important. And to tell stories. I've been a journalist. It's not just, if you want people to engage with something, it's not just a matter of data and feeding back facts and outcomes and findings. It's somehow to present that in a way to people that becomes a story that they can latch onto and understand. I don't mean that to sound patronizing, but it'll run so much better if there's something that folk can get a hold of in a storytelling sort of way. Then that makes for much greater success, I think, anyway.
Good. Well, I think I'm responsible for timekeeping, so that's 14:59. So thanks very much, folk, for being here and listening to this. Thanks very much indeed, Jim, for coming along. We've really benefited, I think, and hugely enjoyed your recollections of the past few decades, and more importantly, how we got here. Because I'm certainly aware that, as I say, half the audience may be under 30, and there's a sense in which life is moving so fast that the 1980s and 1990s is a foreign country, and yet history is a continuum, and we're only here doing this research because of those who've come before us.
Actually, perhaps if I could just end with a wee story about this. When it was first published in 1976, it wasn't mainly because it took on the academic community. It wasn't taken much notice of academically. It wasn't reviewed in any academic journal or anything like that. But it was reviewed a lot in the press. And it took off a bit in the Highlands, and I began to be invited to go and give talks about it. And I went to give a talk in Skye, and at the beginning, a butler, Gaelic, an old man, he probably wasn't as old as I am now, but he seemed very old at the time. He came up to me and he said, "I've bought your book and I want to congratulate you." And it cost £10, which was a lot of money then. And I was trying to look suitably modest and say it was nothing, And he said, "Yes," he said, "you're the first person I ever met who made any money out of crofting." So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim and Andy. And I look forward to Lord Michael Forsyth coming to our next clan gathering in a couple of years. Thank you very much. Coffee break now, and then back for the last session in 15 minutes. Thank you.